always tempted to say, okay, class. And, but I do want to get started because we have a lot of ground to cover today, and it'll be very exciting ground. You all signed up for a great series, I will tell you. We've had two very dynamic presentations. This one will be as well. One of the key differences for all of us is that the other two speakers, our first two sessions, their findings, their conclusions, their observations were based on firsthand knowledge of the individuals that they were assessing, that they were trying to develop insights into. This is different. This is about trying to, today's presentation will be about trying to assess somebody. And the term I used in operations was indirectly. You can't put them on the couch and ask them questions and ask them to fill out a questionnaire. You're trying to assess them remotely from a distance. I'm Peter Ernest, the Executive Director, and let me welcome you all here for this morning's session. And let me tell you something about Jerry, and I would like to. Jerry was a colleague at CIA, and Jerry was one of the trailblazers. He started something no one else had done. He had received his medical degree from Yale University. He has devoted his life to the field of political psychology. And he spent 21 years with CIA and founded and directed the Center for the Analysis of Personality and Political Behavior. It's an interdisciplinary behavioral science providing assessments of foreign leadership and decision-making. He provided this to the President and other senior officials to prepare for summit meetings, high-level negotiations, and crisis situations. He played the lead role in the Camp David profiles of Menachem Begum and Anwar Sadat for President Carter, and he initiated the U.S. program in understanding the psychology of terrorism. He received the Intelligence Medal of Merit in 1979 and numerous other awards, including the Nevitz Sanford Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions to Political Psychology. He has had numerous honors in his field. He is he has been chair of the Task Force for National and International Terrorism and Violence for the American College of Psychiatrists. He's published widely. He has lectured widely on the subjects of political violence and the psychology of political violence and terrorism and numerous related fields. Co-author of a study of illness in high office, when illness strikes the leader, the dilemma of the captive king. And he's done a number of books, several of which we have here. Jerry's agreed to stay behind to after the presentation. He will take questions and he will sign books, and we have a number of them back there. But they include the psychological evaluation of political leaders, psychology of political behavior, Know Thy Enemy, profiles of adversary leaders. He currently is teaching at GW, the fundamentals of political psychology, political violence, and terrorism, and independent study and research. Jerry, it's just a delight to have you. Please help me welcome Dr. Jerrold Post. Yeah.
Thanks, Jerry. Well, thank you for that warm welcome, Peter, and it's good to be back again here. This presentation comes at an interesting time. I finished up literally 2 days ago my work on a committee that I've been struggling with for the last year and a half on deterrence in the 21st century for the National Academy of Sciences. And it occurred to someone that our deterrence strategy is still based on the doctrine of MAD, mutual assured destruction. And we're in a situation now where we have people like Khamenei of Iran, where we have that strange young fellow Kim Jong-un, where the assumption that our adversary would be rational is not necessarily accurate. And one of our major conclusions is that we needed to have nuanced, accurate political personality profiles of the leadership with which we're contending. And a number of them are dictators. Now, I want you to notice my title, Dictators and Their Disciples in a Dangerous World. You cannot be a dictator all by your lonesome. And I thought I would start, just to refresh your memory, a little bit about two dictators that automatically come to mind. Well, let me first get to them. So this unstable international environment we're in has heightened the need for this nuanced understanding. And we need to have adversaries clearly taped. This rise of rogue leaders and outlaw nations is particularly of concern, and yet we tend still to use a rational actor perspective all too often. When you read in the newspaper, Beijing is likely to do this, or Tehran is likely to do that, it automatically throws you into what's the sensible, rational thing that I would do in their place. That is the rational national actor model, and we are not talking about rational national actors. One of the difficulties now is that the proliferation of destructive power in the hands of leadership with hostile anti-U.S. agendas is multiplying. We have Iraq, although that piece is broken out there, as you know, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. And I will be talking about leaders of all of these countries, some brief capsules. One of the concerns, though, is that the leaders were or are seeking or already have weapons of mass destruction. And it's quite a different thing countering or deterring an individual you're trying to keep, or a country you're trying to keep from having this, and getting them in a less threatening situation once they're on that road. And that's what we're struggling with. I see this morning that Kerry will be meeting with senior Iranian officials, and they're trying to get these negotiations on track, but it's a very interesting and complex challenge. The Carnegie Corp Commission on Avoiding Deadly Conflict took itself to Bermuda and was thinking through with some actually giant figures. One of these was someone I consider my mentor, Alexander George. He in particular emphasized the importance of what he called actor-specific behavioral models. He was referring to the kind of profiles I've done over the years. And all too often we tend to think, what would I do in such and such a leader's place? I'm going to try to get you to a different place than that. So to counter effectively the range of interests in the new post-Cold War security environment, we have to have these accurate assessments, particularly for, and this is leader-dominant societies, namely societies under dictatorial control. That's a long lead-in to this title here, but I think important to cover that ground. I'd like to begin first with the destructive, charismatic leader of which a prime example is Adolf Hitler. He is not a leader of our time, but I'd like you to understand two leaders as a background, and I'll provide some information you may not have heard before, both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Notice these youth with their hands up. It's rather compelling because we are talking now not just about the dictatorial leader. We're talking about a group of individuals who see this figure in Hitler's time as in almost a godlike fashion, surrendering their individuality to him psychologically. Now, Hitler was a most interesting man. Some of you may have seen on BBC The Mind of Adolf Hitler. I had the pleasure of narrating that, and I think you may be able to obtain that disc or online. It shows periodically on the History Channel. And he had a very twisted background indeed. Hitler was a man who had what we would call, I'm a psychiatrist as you know, a wounded self. And how did this man, not very Aryan looking in his pictures here, manage to command the allegiance of so many? First, one has to understand we had a tremendously wounded German body politic. And he had this intense demonic kind of way of externalizing all of Germany's problems and blaming it on them, the Jew. And the intensity of his anti-Semitism lent itself to the time. Something like 70% of the studies of their National Academy of Sciences was on the purity of the blood, an interesting statistic. But what was it about Hitler that met so well the psychology of the German body politic? I have in my office at George Washington a portrait of Hitler propaganda poster with him with a white doctor's uniform on and a stethoscope in the pocket. Adolf Hitler, physician to the diseased German body politic. In his speeches, there are these medical references, and I do a lot of content analysis of leaders' speeches. The Jew is a tubercle bacillus that is infecting the German body politic. The Jew is a toxin that is poisoning the German body politic. The Jew is a cancer that must be cut out of the German body politic. By the way, that language is the identical language almost of Hamas, and you'll be hearing in their founding documents in terms of the need to cut out the cancer that is destroying this our youth, our country. So this was a very strong and powerful feeling he was carrying within him, and he was taking, it would seem auto-psychobiographically, there's some very interesting matters which are spelled out in Waite's book, The Psychopathic God. He suspected he was tainted by Jewish blood. His paternal grandmother gave birth out of wedlock to a child at age 41. The father was unrecorded. He was married, she was a domestic for the Frankenberger family who paid financial support to Maria and the child for 14 years. And it's hard not to think that this represented paternity money. He was threatened with blackmail by his cousin for his, quotes, Jewish blood. One of the fascinating documents here is the Nuremberg racial laws, the law for the protection of the blood. And paragraph 3, which was written by Hitler himself, declared, Jews cannot employ household servants of German or related blood that are under 45 years of age, the putative age of menopause. So had that law been in place, that would have protected the contamination of him. Of course, it would have kept him from being born in the first place, but that's another story. Stalin. And just to be clear for just a minute. So I'm suggesting that his intensity of anti-Semitism was spurred by his feeling that there was this contaminated place within me, and I must get rid of it. And he projected that onto the whole German body politic. And in his effort at the Holocaust, he was trying to cleanse this contaminated place within him. Young Stalin absorbed beatings from his father, a violent man who drank heavily. He went from the Gori church school into the Russian Orthodox Theological Seminary, which is a brutal place, very paranoid environment. The monks were spying on people all the time. And his way of rebelling was to rebel against their ban on importing secular books. And in particular, he smuggled in the works of Marx and Lenin. And he came to greatly admire Lenin. And when he broke out of the seminary at age 20, and look at this fiery-eyed revolutionary, he became an acolyte of and was really mentored by Lenin how to be a revolutionary. But at age 41, in the middle of the midlife crisis, he confronted Lenin, demanding more power. Lenin died shortly thereafter, and Stalin went on to consolidate his rule. Indeed, at the end of his life, he was dominated by political paranoia, and we had a case study of him in my second book called Political Paranoia. And it is estimated he killed some 23 million enemies, feared or imagined, maintained total control over the network, through a network of informers. and controlled over his subordinates, too, in a remarkable fashion. I want to share an anecdote from Erich Fromm, who shared this diagnosis. He called him non-sexual sadism. And this story was spread far and wide amongst his advisors. Mid-level apparatchik in his group of advisors was invited with his wife to a special dinner in the Kremlin. And it was in Stalin's private dining room. And with this one in service for each, fine food, vintage wines. And he knew he was marked for success, and he'd be getting a promotion soon. That morning at 4 in the morning, the secret police broke into his home, arrested him, and had him executed. And what was being conveyed by this was that Stalin has total whimsical control over you, and he can make you rise to the heights or destroy you just because he woke up that morning with a little bit of discomfort in his bowels. It's a remarkable case of total control over individuals, and this was what he maintained throughout his life. Now, what you may not be aware of is Stalin was the model for our next hero, Saddam Hussein. I had the opportunity of testifying twice before the House of Representatives in the run-up to the war in Iraq, and the material I'll be sharing with you was presented to both the House Armed Services Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. This is a somewhat complicated diagram. It's kind of the way I think about people, in layers. At the very bottom, on the left, we have a mud hut. He was born in a mud hut, an irony of ironies. When he was found at the end, he was in a so-called spider hole in a mud hut, ashes to ashes. That represents the wounded place in his psychology. He is the most traumatized leader I have ever profiled. And let me give you a few pieces of background, and you'll understand and perhaps even have some compassion for him. When in the 4th month, the troubles really go back to his mother's womb. In the 4th month of his mother's pregnancy with him, her husband died. In the 8th month of the same pregnancy, her firstborn son died under the surgeon's knife. She naturally became rather depressed about this, and first tried to commit suicide, then to abort herself of the pregnancy. When Saddam was born, and you'll all recall, that's really when that bonding begins very powerfully with that newborn child. She would not take him to breast, turned away, and her brother, Saddam's uncle, Heir, took charge of raising him for the first 2.5 years of his life until the mother remarried. He went to her for the first time at that time, and the new stepfather was brutal to Saddam psychologically and physically, very abusive. That's a pretty terrible way to begin this life. It's hard to imagine a more terrible way. When he was 8 years old, he asked his parents, could he have schooling, like his cousin, Heir's son, and was told no. He fled the family household, went back to his uncle Heir, who raised him from then on, and told him that someday he would follow in the pathway of Saladin and Nebuchadnezzar, and he would be a great leader in Arab history. At the top, my architectural motif, that's one of the magnificent palaces throughout the land. That's sitting on top of that wounded self always. But it was his compensation, his grandiose self, and he had these dreams of glory. Someday he too would be in the ranks of Saladin and Nebuchadnezzar and Nasser. But what was underneath the palace? Does anyone know?
Torture chambers.
Torture chambers, that too, but also basically underground bunkers where he was ready to be attacked, ready to defend himself. And that's a nice a metaphor, I think, for the psychological siege state, which was his default position psychologically. So this is his political personality profile. He is not, as I testified to Congress, the madman of the Middle East. He's a rational political calculator who often miscalculated. And part of the reason he miscalculated was A, he was fairly ethnocentric, but most importantly, he was surrounded by a group of sycophants who, for good reason, were afraid to tell him what he needed to hear. They told him what he wanted to hear. And when I say for good reason, let me tell you the story. In 1982, Saddam they were in trouble. The war he had started with Iran in 1980 was going badly. Missiles were flying into Baghdad, and he made a proffer of a ceasefire to Khomeini, who was obsessed with him by this time, Khomeini of Iran. And Khomeini said to Saddam, "There'll be no peace between us until you are no longer the president of Iraq." So Saddam went to his cabinet. I want you to imagine you're my cabinet. And he said, "Gentlemen," he didn't have ladies in his cabinet. He said, "Gentlemen, we have a dilemma. We need to stop this conflict. It's going very badly. But Khomeini says there'll be no peace between us until I am no longer your president. What say you?" And everyone says, "Saddam is Iraq, Iraq is Saddam. There is no Iraq without you." And he smiles and says, "Well, that's really nice of you to say, but I'd like your frank, candid, and creative suggestions." And his Oxford-educated Minister of Health, Dr. Ibrahim, said, "Well, Saddam, you might want to think about stepping down temporarily until our peace is secured and then resuming the presidency," which I personally think was a rather shrewd suggestion. As the story goes, when he said that, Saddam coldly thanked him for his candor and had him arrested on the spot. The minister's wife went to Saddam that night and said, "Please, my husband has always been loyal to you. He's always served you. Please promise me you'll return my husband to me." And he apparently was deeply touched by this and promised her he would, and he returned her husband to her the next day, the only promise he's ever kept, by the way. He returned her husband the next day to her in a black canvas body bag chopped into pieces. This powerfully concentrated the rest of the minister's attentions, and to a man they said the war must go on, and it went on for a bloody 8 years. Now, but this story being spread, and there are numerous stories like this, some of which have been videoed, including the very his ascension to power in the first place, when he's sitting with a black cigar, and this is on video, and I commented on this on public television. He was consumed when he took power that there were 21 of the leaders, say a couple of hundred top senior officials, all gathered in that auditorium, and these 21 he didn't trust. And he took one of those 21, arrested him, and told him about the plot he was going to confess to publicly. No such plot. And if he didn't confess to it, his family would be tortured and executed. So there they all are, and the first person is called up while his cowering conspirator is up there. Ahmed. Was Ahmed a conspirator? No. Mahmoud. Was Mahmoud a conspirator? Yes. At this point, 2 goons from the security force come and take Mahmoud away. And they went through every one of the 200 people in the room, and all 21 were pulled out. And everyone was quivering with relief that he hadn't been named, because they all knew these people and knew there was no such plot. And then this reminds me a little bit of Stalin's way of dealing with that dinner. And then he said, "As your reward, as for your loyalty to me, you will all form the firing squads tomorrow morning," and divided them up into 21 groups. You don't have to have too many episodes like that to know that I need to tell him what he wants to hear, and never to quarrel with him publicly or constructively criticize. So people wonder, how could he have gone into such a terrible, dangerous course? No one would constructively criticize him, because to do so is not only to possibly lose your job, but could even lose your life. So he has what I call the most dangerous political personality, and it's one that is true of dictators in general. And in his mind, as I mentioned, Saddam and Iraq were one and the same. We told the House, indeed he had a pattern of reversing himself, that he could reverse himself, but this is a double contingency. A, if he could save face, and B, if he could retain power. And moreover, if he was backed into a corner, he could lash out, as he did, lighting the oil fields of fire. But this is a double contingency. And you may recall in the event, President George H.W. Bush pounded on the table and said, there will be no face saving. And a story was leaked about the contingency plan to kill Saddam. So there was no reason for him to believe, he didn't have to be irrational to believe that he could not say, as we were apparently hoping, gee, I'm sorry, fellows, I didn't mean to disturb you, let me leave Kuwait. So this malignant narcissism, extreme grandiosity, Saddam is Iraq, Iraq is Saddam, no capacity to empathize, views himself as one of Hitler's great leaders, no constraint of conscience, unconstrained aggression, and a paranoid orientation. Not paranoid crazy, but ready to see someone else as the cause of his problems. One of the things I think it's terribly important to understand about the dynamics of that conflict with this dictatorial leader, he had always dreamed of being recognized as one of the world's great socialist leaders. He thought he should be ranked with Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Tito, Castro, and the world had not seen him as being a great world leader. When he invaded Kuwait, suddenly his name was on everyone's mouth. Every headline was filled with him. I see this as an explosion of narcissism. It was dreams of glory fulfilled. His uncle had told him someday he would be considered one of the world's great leaders. He gave a guttural grunt, and oil barrel prices jumped $20 a barrel, and the Dow Jones fell to 100 points. He was really in the catbird's seat. To retreat back to Iraq and obscurity was psychologically impossible for him. And again, I wanted to, that's a very brief, and we won't, there are lots of twists and turns in this tale, but he also was rather interesting. You mentioned the torture chambers under the palace. He was a rather unusual father. He had hopes, part of his dreams of glory were to have his sons, Uday and Qusay, one of them succeed him. Rather than take his kids to soccer games, he took them into the torture chambers and had them watch people being tortured to death. My motto from that is, the family that slays together stays together. So, with that, let me turn to someone who fortunately has disappeared from the stage, President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran. Very bright young boy. He was excluded from his Quran classes because he insisted he could read the Quran, which he could, and they said he was too young. He took the university exam, predicted he would finish in the top 10 nationally, which suggests a very special sense of self. He did finish in the top 1%, but he really was very scary with his rhetoric. In a conference in Tehran in October 2005 entitled "The World Without Zionism," the establishment of the Zionist regime was a move by the world oppressors against the Islamic world. The state of Israel was illegitimate, and referring to Ayatollah Khomeini, as the Imam said, Israel must be wiped off the map. At the same time, he was pushing for this nuclear program. He put those two together, and there was every reason for Israel to have existential fears. So between these extreme comments on Israel and pushing for this nuclear enrichment, he seemed to be pushing for confrontation, for trying to create chaos. Why? And here it's important, and one of the first matters our group would do, we had a cultural anthropologist, political sociologist in my interdisciplinary team, is understanding I wouldn't have people look at a leader until they've been immersed themselves in the history, politics, and culture of their country. The Twelver branch of Shiite Islam, some of you may be familiar with, refers to the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, in lineal descent, who is said to have gone into a state of occultation in 874 AD. Now that's a peculiar term, but as best I can tell, it's kind of suspended animation hiding in that well. And according to legend, he's not dead, but will reveal himself in a period of chaos for the battle of the final days. And this is a little bit like, as in the book of Revelations too, the chaos that precedes the arrival of the Messiah. Most Twelvers are quietists, waiting for the arrival of the hidden Imam. But there is a small group of religious belligerents. We find this in all of the fundamentalist religions, that there is a group of activists who believe that by pious acts they can hasten the arrival of the Messiah. Ahmadinejad there's good reason to believe he is such an activist. He was mentored by Ayatollah Yazdi, who is a committed activist, Twelver Muslim. It was Yazdi who mentioned to Khamenei in what was kind of a close election, you should throw your support to Ahmadinejad. During his tenure as mayor of Tehran, he made major investments in preparing the infrastructure for the arrival of the Mahdi, which he informed an Iranian journalist would be in 2 years. After that surprise victory, he gave $17 million to the Jamkharan Mosque, which houses the well from which some believe the Mahdi will emerge. In November 25th, he said publicly, the main mission of the Islamic Republic was to bring about the appearance of the 12th Imam. You may recall in September 2005, he gave this long, rambling address before the United Nations. And he was caught on videotape telling a cleric that during the speech, a halo appeared around his head on the podium. Fortunately, we have captured this on film. There we are. And this is what he said: I felt the atmosphere suddenly change, and for 27 or 28 minutes, the leaders of the world did not blink. It seemed as if a hand was holding them there, and it opened their eyes to receive the message from the Islamic Republic. So, if the apparent drive to develop a nuclear weapon and the calls to wipe Israel off the map seem designed to produce chaos, that may indeed have been Ahmadinejad's goal. There are major implications here for deterrability, but ultimate authority, fortunately, is not with the president. It was really quite constrained by the supreme leader. And the new President Rouhani has been described as a moderate, which is not a notion you should keep in your mind. He's a moderate amongst extremists, and indeed has been loyal to Khamenei from the beginning. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the Vali Faki, because of unquestioning political loyalty to Khomeini, replaced Khomeini as Supreme Leader, despite having not adequate religious authority. He lacked credentials, but because of his weakness, he's always balancing one faction against the other, Rafsanjani versus the theocratic conservatives. Is Iran deterrable? One needs to have a very accurate picture of the decision-making calculus in Iran, which is not under one dominant leader. There are multiple autonomous forces, and in addition, they're having more and more trouble keeping the Iranian populace, which is really wired. Everyone is on the internet. They're seeing what life in the West is, yearn to join the West, and some 2/3 of the population is wearing a fine dress under their chadors. So this is going to be interesting as this plays out. There's some loosening of the hold on the population, but the vice police are still circulating, and any woman who reveals her arm or doesn't have a headscarf on can be thrown into prison. Now, to my next. One cannot think about the current leader without understanding him in his historical past. Now, this is from the official Kim biography. I might say, of all the leaders I have profiled, the entire Kim sequence has been the one I'm least confident of, because the information available and distinguishing myth and reality is very difficult. But we have enough to be giving some suggestions at least, but this all has a little asterisk next to it. There are many families in the world that produce great men, but there is not such a great family as Marshal Kim Jong-il's family, all of whose members were famous as patriots generation after generation. The Mangandai family is the greatest pride of our nations. Well, that's pretty heady stuff. Kim Il-sung, the great leader, the founding father of North Korea, a mythic guerrilla fighter, rose to power under the patronage of Stalin and has been named the eternal president, which is a fairly clever move by Kim Jong-il because, especially in terms of the economic woes of the country, he can point back at his father. But unlike father, unlike son, Kim Jong-il was raised to succeed the heroic, charismatic Kim Il-sung. He's no guerrilla fighter or nation builder. And indeed, the myth that this is the man from Mount Baekdu, but actually he was the boy from the Soviet Union, and he was raised under Soviet protection, but on the official biography, he was in the born in the sacred mountain of Mount Baekdu, from which the Korean peninsula is said to have emerged. His first job was as director of the Bureau of Propaganda and Agitation, which was responsible for creating the heroic image of his father, Kim Il-sung, and of perpetuating that he was would kind of inherited charisma. So there's a very real disparity between this boy, now dead, Kim Jong-il, and his father, and indeed a real disparity with Kim Jong-un as well. So Majesty sat uncomfortably on his shoulders. Succeeding a powerful father is a challenge. Succeeding, as religious history tells us, a father of godlike stature is psychologically impossible. So he was trapped by his father's ideology. By the early 70s, it was clear that Kim Il-sung was preparing his son to take over the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Kim Jong-il was given the task of announcing the 10 principles, required absolute loyalty to Kim Il-sung, and reinforced Kim Jong-il as aligned with his father. And he worked behind the scenes while his father remained a political force. By the early 80s, he was in day-to-day control. This is very different, I want to emphasize this, from Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, who was only after the massive stroke that Kim Jong-il had that he chose his successor. Very insecure about his appearance was Kim Jong-il. 5'2", he wore 4-inch lifts in his shoes. He was called Shorty when he was growing up, referred to himself to Madam Kim Chung-wi, the South Korean actress he kidnapped. The first words he said to her, "You must be surprised to see me. I am small as a midget's droppings." They had this Kim Jong-il Longevity Institute dedicated to the health management of him. They were responsible for all meals and inspected every grain of rice, which all had to come from the rice paddies on Mount Baekdu. That's where the water all came from too. And any right grain of rice that was a little bit chipped was unsuitable for him. He's reported to be emotionally volatile and unpredictable. Lived in a 7-story pleasure palace, gave extravagant gifts to senior leaders, including $600,000 armored Mercedes-Benz limousines. Liked to throw wild parties. He recruited girls with clear complexions to be part of his joy brigades, which provided entertainment and relaxation for his hardworking senior officials. One interesting piece of intelligence, and as Peter knows, some of the best intelligence often comes from open sources. The source for this intelligence is the Hennessy Fine Spirits Corporation annual report. During the 1990s, for a decade, he spent between $650,000 and $800,000. It was selling for about $630 a bottle annually on the finest Hennessy cognac called Paradis. The average income of the North Koreans was $900 to $1,000. He had a movie collection in excess of 10,000 to 20,000 titles. And I found this rather fascinating. I wrote an op-ed piece for the LA Times noting this point. It could only be for the LA Times since that's the site of Hollywood, called Kim Jong, North Korea, the movie, and suggested that his self-concept of himself as a leader came from Westerns, which he was a particular fan of Shane or Shootout in the OK Corral. But the movie that seemed to fit him best for me, and I have no idea whether he saw this, but included it in the article, was the Peter Sellers movie, The Mouse That Roared. I thought this was here's this twerpy little guy waving his nuclear weapons at the world and expecting the world to cower. And indeed, for years, as it was nearly bankrupt, we were paying monies to help support, and South Korea was as well, as was China, and he called this tribute for his magnificent leadership. Anyone who hasn't seen that movie, you must see it, by the way. You get it on Netflix. It's quite fabulous. The way to get wealthy is to lose a war to the United States. Peter Sellers concludes in the role he's playing. And look what happened to Germany and Japan. And therefore, they invade the United States in a sailboat on Cape Cod and manage to get control of a nuclear site. Quite fun. So this man has malignant narcissism, too, Korean style. Extreme grandiosity, but underlying insecurity about stepping into his father's godlike shoes. A lack of empathy for the Korean people. It is not entirely clear that he was aware of the degree of poverty in his nation. Quoted with pride on the one occasion when he and his father disagreed, when his father asked and pled, "Must we spend so much on the military? Couldn't we provide more to our people?" And replied, "No, father, the military requires these funds." No constraint of conscience, paranoid orientation, very optimistic about himself, underestimates the adversary. So the decision-making is not by committee. KJI had enormous ultimate power. And this is probably also true to a significant degree, especially since he killed his uncle with his son, Kim Jong-un. It is believed no military decision of any consequence was made without Kim Jong-il's approval. The only area he wasn't involved in is economic policy. Had this kind of stovepipe, in looking at decision-making, one has to look at the structure. No leader rules a country by himself. He's got a group of subordinates under him who feed him his understanding of the country, basically, and through which he executes policies. It is unlikely there's ever any free exchange of ideas with his advisors, and it is doubted that he asked for expressed uncertainty. Shrewd advisors could get information to him in the form of, in the likelihood that this happened, sort of estimated intelligence, is probable that the United States would do this or Great Britain would do that. Words don't count. And it's interesting to think about that fairly casual injection of this phrase in the speech by President Bush, the axis of evil. Well, if you're included in that axis, as both Iran and North Korea were, and you then watch what happened to the founding member of the axis, Saddam Hussein, it captures your attention. And it can be looked upon as probably part of the race for nuclear weapons by these controlling dictators was for deterrence, that it changes the equation tremendously to come after it, the mighty United States, a country that has or doesn't have a nuclear weapon. He overestimated their own military strength. The propaganda says one DPRK soldier is a match for 100 soldiers, relies on nuclear weapons as compensation, believes the United States to be casualty adverse, something Saddam Hussein believed also. Overestimation of popular dissent in South Korea, underestimation of the discontent in their country. It's interesting. As I went through my seminar, my assessment of Kim, it occurred to me that this was a setup for psychological operations, that the lower level military and the working peasants who are all impoverished, how would they feel knowing how Kim Jong-il lived in the 7th century pleasure palace with these lavish gifts being spread around? And this called for psychological operations. And I got this response with briefing senior Department of Defense officials. Oh, we couldn't do that because they are on this friendship. Everything has to go through South Korea, and they're on this friendship kick now with North Korea. Well, one should point to, I think, in fact, this is to depart from the dictator title. There's a democratic leader of South Korea now, President Park. Her mother and her father were both assassinated. She has scars on her face from an assassination attempt upon her. And she ran on a platform of not being so gracious for the provocations that were coming from the North. So he values his safety and regime survival, the oasis of Pyongyang, personal wealth, elite comfort, and total domestic control. His vulnerabilities, military first, economy is broken, can't be fixed. As many as 3 million North Koreans starved to death in famines. And he asks his population to endure continuing hardships while elites live in luxury. Now, as I mentioned, unlike his father, he did not find a successor until he had this major stroke, which emphasized his mortality, and he started the succession process. Look at this baby-faced guy here. It's hard to imagine him as leader. But unlike Kim Jong-il, then, he was not seasoned. He was only designated as successor after the stroke. There had been great uncertainty as to who would succeed him. He had virtually no experience, but apparently he's militarily brilliant. He was named a 4-star general in the People's Army, deputy chairman of the Military Commission of the Workers' Party, member of the party's Central Committee, and deputy chairman of the Military Commission. There were 2 aggressive acts shortly after he was named successor. One was the attack on the South Korean frigate that killed 46 South Korean sailors. Secondly, artillery shelling Pyongyang Island. Both of those, I believe, were designed to earn him his chops, kind of, and to say to the people, this is a strong leader. South Korea at this time of transition was wise enough not to react to these provocations. But as I said, I don't believe that will continue under the new president. And the greatest hazard to me is that Kim Jong-un, like his father, will be waiving these missile tests and nuclear tests, and the provocations will not be tolerated by the South. So his father was well seasoned, and while there were provocative actions on a number of occasions and frequent belligerent rhetoric, he always showed restraint and pulled back from the brink. In vivid contrast, Kim Jong-un is unseasoned, beginning to assert his own authority, has dismissed generals from his father's circle. And as you know, about a month ago now, he killed the regent, his uncle, who was perhaps some restraining influence on him. The circumstances of this potential graft there was not entirely clear. But I see the danger is not of him consciously setting off the start of nuclear war, but stumbling into it because of his inexperience. And with that, my medical colleague, Bashar al-Assad, what a handsome fellow. His father, a remarkably powerful leader, ruled Syria with an iron fist for 29 years, maintained the emergency laws from 1963. In the Hama massacre, some of you may have read Tom Friedman's book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, where he talks about Hama rules, where when this group, he was patient, waited to have this mutiny stopped, and when it didn't, he massively attacked and paved over the entire city. He, too, wanted to have succession in the family. He's a member of the Alawite minority, and designated his eldest son, who was a charismatic, bold fellow, just in his image, as his successor. He was chief of presidential security, a rather forceful character. He died in a car accident in January of '94. Bashar, of Hafez's soft and gentle second son, was an ophthalmologist in London, and I was going to tell you this was all classified. I once appeared before the interdisciplinary seminar and presented what I told them was the most highly classified document the agency had ever prepared. And I asked the assistant at the back, had he gotten the special clearance for these senior government officials? These were all super grades from across the government. And he said yes. And I then showed him my study of Moshe Dayan with the black patch, and I said, this is classified I only. When Bashar was appointed, his Hafez's third son, Heir, who was much more aggressive and like Hafez in Basel, but Hafez chose Bashar, giving him the role of the dignified leader and Heir the role of the enforcer. He's commander of the Republican Guard, the Army's elite 4th Armored Division. Bashar took power when Hafez died, and there was a hope that Bashar, the westernized man who had been in London for a grand total of a year and a half, would be more liberal and reformist than his father and brothers. And he married this J.P. Morgan investment banker who also was felt would play a positive role. But the Human Rights Report said this is a wasted decade. There was no progress in human rights during Bashar Assad's first 10 years. It may have been that he initially had intentions to reform his country, to reform Syria, but the realities on the ground really made it impossible. Moreover, I believe from the very beginning, he was not, probably the word dictator doesn't fit him very well. He was not in full control. His family and the military were looking over his shoulders. And the initial hopes that this would be a great reform rested on a very fragile foundation. He was already 27 when he moved to London and only spent a year and a half there. Hafez watches over him, and there we have a picture of him watching over him. This was at a ceremony marking the 1-year anniversary of his father's death. The Arab Spring struck Syria too. Protests began in March 2011, a ruthless response by the government. And while he had promised reform, the only model he had psychologically in him was the rather brutal repression of his father. When push comes to shove, blood will out. And a question I want to provide to you is he really in charge? That remarkable interview with Barbara Walters, do you think your forces cracked down too hard? They are not my forces. They are military forces belonging to the government. Okay, but you are the government. I don't own them. I am president. I don't own the country, so they are not my forces. I don't think that's just fending her off. I think that's true. And there's reason to believe that the excesses of violence may be the semi-autonomous younger brother Maher carrying them out. Maher is first in command, not second, said a former Syrian diplomat. Now, there's a remarkable trove of emails that came out, which I went over fairly carefully, and they betray the first couple as indifferent to suffering, concerned only with expensive shoes, chandeliers, and the latest Harry Potter DVD. This detached quality conveys a sense that they are bemused observers and somehow not responsible for the violence unfolding around them. The online distraction suggests they're in over their heads and unable to cope with the deteriorating situation. And I believe there's reason to believe that Bashar himself does not feel he is fully in charge. In an email to Asma, the daughter of the Emir of Qatar, stated two possible paths. And she said this was a little historic review of what's happened to other leaders in the Arab Spring. You can hold on until the bloody end or go into exile, and she offered exile in her country. However, he cannot easily leave and will likely hold on too long for fear of letting the Assad family dynasty crumble on his watch. And he's, in some ways, in over his head, even as we speak. Let me note, it's really important in looking at any leader to understand his relationship with his followers. I had the opportunity of doing a profile of Gaddafi, another strange dictator, and it was quite clear, I felt, that when he said he would not go down until the last drop of his blood, that he meant it. And therefore, what was necessary was to separate him from his followers and provide a soft landing for his senior officials if they defected. And at the end, he was practically alone. I don't see a martyr in Bashar, but it is probably already too late in the question of war crimes hovering around him. But how we handle those who want to leave before it's too late will be important in perhaps helping to isolate him. Right now, however, he has a very strong group around him. Well, with that, I will be open for questions, and that's just portrait of some of the dictators of our time and how important it is to understand them all in their historical and political and cultural constitutions. All right.
About right here? Oh, right here. We'll just start right here at this end, yeah.
I'm interested in the interplay between the radical Islam and these leaders, and how much of it is, fundamental to their character, and how much of it is just used, sort of the opium of the people from the Middle Eastern side.
I would say to that, yes. I think there's a spectrum from totally committed individuals. There's no reason to believe Khomeini, for example, was not fully committed. But there are others around the leader who will take the extremity of his beliefs, and some are just cynically hanging on and exploiting it. And what's necessary is to try to find the wedges, the places of vulnerability in his leadership circle. But certainly in Iran, this goes back a long, long way. I recall on the weekend of the seizure of our embassy in Iran, and this is one of the several occasions Peter knows about when I was almost fired, we had done a profile of Khomeini, and I did a typescript for senior officials, which was called Khomeini's Need for Martyrdom and the Prospect for a Long Siege, suggesting it might approach the Mayaguez length. That was our surveillance ship taken in North Korea, and that the only thing which would end the siege, because of Khomeini's need for martyrdom, was the combination of the keys to the Chase Manhattan Bank and the Shaw's body. Carlucci, who was the DDCI at the time, read this, and at the time, Carter was making statements, if anything is done to harm our brave young men and women, they are going to hurt. We will hurt them. Well, for anyone who's watched the march of people flagellating themselves down the street, this is not exactly a threat. It was more like a love offering. And so Carlucci read this and said, gee, it seems to me that what the president is saying is kind of counterproductive. I said, you're absolutely right. He said, look, we're going to see him tomorrow. He's going over with Stan Turner, the DCI. Would you just give me some talking points? I want you to be totally candid. It's just for me. So I took him literally, and I said something to the effect of the president's threatening to hurt the Iranians if they do anything to our brave young men and women, betrays an abysmal ignorance of Shiite Islam and is designed to make a bad situation impossible, and went on from there. And I then got called that evening. Stan would like you to come down and brief the president personally. So I got in my three-piece and was waiting outside the White House Situation Room, and I never got called. And then Carlucci came out and said, he's in a hurry to get to Camp David, so instead of calling you in, we just gave him your briefing notes. But to his credit, Carter became very enthralled with understanding the psychology of martyrdom, the psychology of Islam, and for the rest of this time, it would be Carter would have a question. It would be relayed to, I think Helms was the DCI then, and then it would go to Post. And we were having a final time with this, but it was absolutely imperative to be understanding Khomeini's disabled state, the nature of Shia Islam, and how deeply steeped in this he was.
Okay, about right here, Laura.
Hi. Early in your talk, you mentioned that we could not view some of these leaders as being rational or being amenable to the same sort of pressures as we had with mutually assured destruction. I wonder if you could comment on Khamenei as opposed to Khomeini. I mean, to me, it looks like he is behaving in a very rational way and is doing an amazing job strategically in negotiating and playing the game with the West. Am I missing something? Is he different from some of these others?
Well, I wouldn't put it he. I think what's imperative in looking at Iran is not to personalize the leadership. It isn't just the supreme leader. You have a number of interesting committees. The former presidential candidate, Rafsanjani, who's a moderate, the king of pistachio nuts, is consulted regularly and has a role in appointing who the next supreme leader will be. So you have one way of thinking about decision-making environments. You can have the predominant leader, and a good example of that is Saddam Hussein. Saddam is Iraq, and the foreign policy was Saddam. Here you have multiple autonomous actors, somewhat in conflict, and what Khamenei sees himself doing is balancing one faction against the other. Having said that, back to your point, they're fairly shrewd bargainers, to be sure, and he has always to reassure his base on the one hand, but on the other hand, seek opportunities, and they're very tough adversary. But you're not just talking about one person here, and you're talking about not unlike in the United States. I mean, after all, what has happened to compound our difficulties in negotiating? You have just almost a veto-proof number of senators who want to increase the sanctions. If they do that, that will destroy the possibility of any of these negotiations going forward. So both sides, one of the problems with the democracy is you've got these annoying opposition voices to pay attention to, including freedom of the press and other such things. So, yes.
Okay, all the way back, right there, yeah.
Hi, you said that Carter was involved in Khomeini's intellect or interested in it, but why did why did Iran give up the hostages to Reagan? Because he said he was going to attack them.
Well, that's a long and complicated story, and what arrangements were made. It is certainly not a coincidence that it occurred on the day of Reagan's inauguration. They were released. One of the things I follow closely is press in the country concern, and when the Iran hostage crisis occurred, there's some interesting posters a friend of mine, who was an Iranian scholar, sent to me, which are widely available in Iran. One of them showed, and there was a change that occurred in the spring, even before the nominating conventions. One of them showed the Khomeini as an angel fighting the Shah as a devil. There's a little American flag on the Shah's cloak. The next one that came out, and you recall the Shah was struggling with illness at this time, an illness I might note which was concealed and really distorted the U.S. responses, us not being aware of this. And on the next one, there was a portrait of the White House and a lightning bolt striking it. And sitting on top of the White House was Jimmy Carter's head. And the lightning bolt was shattering into 1,000 pieces the White House and the Jimmy Carter's head. And it was labeled Islamic Youth. And it says, the youth of Islam will destroy the great Satan, at the top of which is Jimmy Carter. And on the basis of that, we wrote a memo saying basically that Khomeini was threatened by the illness. There was a big debate in the intelligence community with the death of the Shah and the crisis. That would have been very threatening to Khomeini, who needed the Shah as an evil opponent to drive together the various members of his constituency. This, when we offered a medical sanctuary to the Shah of Iran, that provided an opportunity to shift the animus from the Shah to the United States. And it was really quite compelling to watch it. So in our memo, we said that we talked about this change in what was circulating in Iran. Then this suggests that Khomeini is now out to get you, just as he was out to get the Shah earlier. And accordingly, the hostage crisis will probably last throughout the election campaign. And that's part of the reason he did this. It was very threatening to Khomeini to lose his organizing enemy. And we boldly stepped forward and made the United States available to serve that role. And that continues to haunt us to this day.
Have it right here.
Hello. To what degree, if any, do some of these profiles apply to recent American presidents?
My next book will be called Dreams of Glory, narcissism in politics. The first sentence is, if one were to subtract from the ranks of political leaders all those with significant narcissistic personality features, the ranks would be perilously impoverished. Having said that, I'm not going to comment on American leaders. Going back to the Lyndon Johnson, Barry Goldwater election, when the later editor of Hustler magazine edited something called Fact, and he got a hold of the American Psychiatric Association mailing list and sent out a questionnaire. Is Barry Goldwater psychiatrically suitable to be president? And some embarrassing fraction of the membership, something like 15%, including some very distinguished psychiatrists, sent in their responses that he was impulsive and paranoid and will start World War III. And as a consequence, I am always skirting on the edge of the now ethical prohibition on doing political personality profiles of a leader in the light of public day unless you have interviewed him and have his permission. We'll talk about over beer one day, but not here.
I take one right here.
We get these recurring debates when a long-standing dictator like the Shah or Mubarak is overthrown. There are people who say that, the United States cannot be trusted to protect its longtime friends, and others say that, we should have abandoned the leader decades ago. So where do you stand on this?
He may be a dictator, but he's our dictator. I think all too often, in the interest of realpolitik, we are supporting leaders who later come back to haunt us. Don't forget, we played a role in supporting Osama bin Laden in a quite important role in his overthrow of the Soviets in Afghanistan. One of the reasons I think it's imperative to really understand whom we are dealing with answers your question. Very much Saddam was empowered by us at one point because we were concerned about Iran. Very much Osama bin Laden was, and it's really imperative in terms of not being blinded by short-term gains to neglect the long-term consequences.
Thank you. I'm just wondering how you view Vladimir Putin. Do you view him as a stronger dictator, one who wants to resurrect the old Soviet Union? And is Ukraine the big test?
I haven't done a formal profile of him, but I think he's a fascinating leader. It's not just resurrect the Soviet Union, really resurrect the culture of the Tsar in some ways. The manner in which he handles the press is quite interesting. Woe be unto the reporter who too actively criticizes him, he or she, and there's that famous woman journalist who was shot by, undoubtedly, at his command. He also had this background in the KGB and still seems to operate in some similar fashions. He himself, or Russia itself, is playing a major role in impeding things going forward with the peace conference in Syria, and Syria was always a major patron state of the Soviet Empire. I find it really interesting to see how much he wanted to improve his image with the Olympics, but this is a very dangerous man.
Back there, sure.
I wondered if you might skip to the other side of the world, which I think we sorely neglect personally, and address how Chavez totally destroyed Venezuela, and it's now continuing. We used to be friends.
Chavez was a very interesting character. And one of the more interesting aspects, I commented fairly actively during his battle with cancer. I went to a CSIS-sponsored conference on the prospects for Venezuela, and no one, I was in the audience, and no one mentioned the trivial fact that he was dying, which and was going to affect him. His language was very interesting. He identified himself with Christ, and he saw himself as playing a role in the battle between the United States and Venezuela. Under his sponsorship, a general was called out of retirement who was asked to rewrite the doctrine of the Soviet military academies. And the new doctrine was really quite compelling, and we paid insufficient attention to it in some ways as this was being done. A, the major enemy is the United States. B, because of the inequality between us, we must wage the war of the fleas, which meant an insurgency, terrorism, and any country is entitled to develop nuclear power, and we are too. So this was a very dangerous man who really destroyed the Venezuelan economy. If you like, I have a profile which was published for the military. I'd be glad to send you a copy. Just give me your address. But Maduro is apparently carrying on in the same fashion. We just had this arrest of 3 members of the consular staff, whether they were CIA agents undercover, I don't know. But he seems to be trying to carry on in Chavez's manner, but without his charismatic appeal.
Other than just leaders, can you do profiles of countries, say like you were talking about Iran having different factions? Can you look ahead and profile the different factions and see if one is going to come to the fore and suppress the others, or if the whole country is going to break apart?
Well, that's a very intelligent question and makes a very important point that one needs. You can't just look at a leader. You have to look at that context in which he's operating. How factionalized is it? Is there dialogue among the factions? Is there a faction in power, such as the case with Syria now, which is a minority faction, which cannot afford to compromise? This was the reason when I formed my unit at CIA, which was described by Peter. The first person I hired was a cultural anthropologist. The next person, a political sociologist, all at the doctorate level at the time of resources. Had 3 political scientists, each with a specialty in leadership in their dissertation, and had a regional expert, or not a regional expert, but had an expert from each of the major regions. And we would always team people, a psychiatrist with a cultural anthropologist, a psychologist, with a political sociologist. So we were ensuring that we accurately depicted how that country was functioning and what a move by this leader in this fashion would do to mobilize or to diminish his greed. So that's extremely important. One of the things which tends to happen is clientitis, so that some analysts will be with a country so long they almost see it too much through that country's eyes. I recall there was a major retrospective examination by Bob Jervis, the leading political scientist, the intelligence failure in terms of not sufficiently predicting the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini. And other things being equal, we'll tend to look at the country as we did before. And there was a sense that the Shah can put down any disturbance that's necessary, can be flexible when he needs to, and be strong when he needs to be, as he has in the past. What was missing, though, is we didn't know the Shah was dying. And that totally changed the equation. And too much of our assessment was coming through the eyes of Savak, the Shah's secret intelligence service. So one must know when someone is fighting for his life while he's fighting for his country's survival. This powerfully affects that psychology.
Why don't we take one more question right here? Amanda, thanks. Okay.
Can you talk about the Castro brothers?
The Castro. Oh, I thought Fidel Castro has always been one of my fascinating leaders. I've done a number of profiles on him, but one of the things which happened in a way, I mean, he was the very emblematic, charismatic leader. And he would give early in his career these 8-hour speeches, and you could see the people were dropping like flies in the audience, and he was getting stronger. He fed on the energy from his idolizing followers, and gradually he became middle-aged, and his followers became middle-aged, and the revolution became middle-aged without really having accomplished the goals he had. But he was a remarkably adroit person at fixing blame with the United States for difficulties, including our economic boycott. I always enjoy following humor in a country, and there was this wonderful story that was circulating in Cuba at the time of the Mariel boat lift, when everyone was fleeing, and he had turned that around to seize victory from the jaws of defeat by releasing people from mental hospitals and prisons, which became a great problem in Florida. The joke was he was known for his sexual prowess, and there was this young, beautiful Cuban woman that he was very anxious to bed down, and the story was that he took her walking on the beach outside of Havana, and the moon was glittering on the waters, and he said, "If you will go to bed with me, I will promise you anything, anything." She said, "Anything?" He said, "Anything." He said, "Promise me you will let anyone who wants to leave Cuba go." And he chucked her under the chin and said, "Oh, my darling, you want to be all alone with me."
Dr. Jerrold Post, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation.